Thanks for watching the video. This is Pascal for EMP Reviews. I mentioned in my Inception video that I wasn't going to review Tenet as it did not do well financially, and that was partially due to the film being released in the midst of the lockdown, but it's also because many have considered it Christopher Nolan's worst epic. But due to the fact that I love it and that Art, who has helped me in several other reviews, suggested we cover this film, here is our experience of this rather confusing sci-fi thriller. I wanted to release this video before Oppenheimer hit theaters, but several occurrences in my life prevented an earlier release. Due to the complexity of the film, the approach to Tenet will be in two parts. The first video will explain the events of the movie as quickly as possible, but with descriptions of all the important parts, while the second video will be a review. As a side note, actor John David Washington's character will be referred to as the man, Washington, or the protagonist. The film starts at an opera house in Tallinn City in Estonia. As the crowds are gathering and the musicians are tuning up, a group of terrorists interrupt the event even before it starts. Outside the venue, the protagonist and his crew sneak into the building posing as members of the local rescue team. These authorities flood the location with sleeping gas, prompting the invaders to mask themselves. Washington makes contact and saves the man the terrorists were actually there to capture, along with seizing a technological device. The attack by the assailants at the concert hall is actually a cover for those two goals. A gun battle erupts, and meanwhile, the man discovers explosives and is saved by one of his teammates when exposed by one soldier as a fraud. Though successful in the overall mission, when rejoining his team and the man, Washington orders some of his men to help him remove the bombs set by the extremists, which was not part of the original plan. He is caught again, but this time rescued by an unknown soldier using an inverted projectile. After the explosives are discarded and detonate away from the crowds, the Russian men who initially assisted the team revealed themselves to be duplicitous. They killed the contact man, torture the protagonist and one of his men. Though bound and tangled, the man manages to get to a suicide pill covertly handed to him by his teammate. He wakes up, presumably days later, to be told that someone betrayed his team, now all dead. Also, the suicide pill was a test he passed, as it was benign, an act which showed his noteworthy dedication, facts pointed out to him by his superior Faye, in addition to details of the necessary and beneficial medical procedures he received after his assault. After dismissing his attempt to resign, Faye describes that the success of his next assignment will have repercussions for all of humanity. He describes a gesture, a combination with the word Tenet, that will grant him access to helpful and also dangerous doorways. After some physical maintenance and investigation of equipment he's been given, he is arranged to meet Laura, who explains to him the details of how time inversion actually works. She grants him access to this information when he responds with a phrase including the word Tenet, when she encounters him with an inquiring description of his presence at her location. She shows him a large catalog of items that are inverted, objects that have been altered in the future. The real danger about their existence, she explains, is that they imply the possibility that much more dangerous weapons could be altered, such as nuclear arms, putting many lives and the future itself in jeopardy. This collection is a sign of a coming war. He asks for an inspection of the materials the altered bullets he then fires inversely were created with, and uses that information to discover where in the world they were produced. This information would also disclose where the bullet that saved his life at the opera house came from. The results send him to Mumbai in order to meet with Sanjay Singh, an arms dealer. As the merchant never leaves his highly elevated house, he meets Neil, a handyman that arranges for the two of them to reach the high location undetected. After attempting to deny being the manufacturer of the projectiles, Singh's wife Priya and Washington exchange a few words, both of them using the word Tenet, which opened a less threatening conversation. Priya is the actual arms dealer, using her husband as cover, considering being in a man's world, as she described it. She discloses that the actual source of the weapons is Andrei Sator, a Russian billionaire who seemingly made his fortune in gas and then moved to London, the result of a rumored breakup with Moscow. Priya describes that his source of funds was actually plutonium and that he himself had the arms she sold to him inverted. She believes that he is receiving information from the future and describes the importance of discovering what that information is. The protagonist meets with Priya's British contact, Sir Michael Crosby. He described Sator as someone who grew up in Stalks 12. Though now an official town, it was an undisclosed Soviet city in the 1970s which was eventually abandoned due to some disaster and then later used for underground tests. At the time of the incident at the Opera House, an explosion was detected there. Sator originated from Stocks 12 with enormous funds and managed to establish his way into the British elite through his wife Catherine Barton, niece of a prominent national. The marriage is very troubled. She being an art appraiser, Crosby gives the protagonist a painting for Catherine to examine as a way to use her to get to her husband. It's one of two fake Goya pieces, as the other was declared genuine by Barton and subsequently purchased for millions of dollars by Sator at an auction. Both pieces were made by Tomás Arepo, a Spanish artist rumored to have been intimate with Barton. After some wardrobe criticism by Crosby, Washington meets Barton with the counterfeit for a supposed appraisal. He claims that he acquired it from Arepo. He also describes that the real value in the piece is that it is evidence that Catherine defrauded her husband when declaring the Goya piece authentic, which he subsequently purchased. The man's attempt at blackmailing her to set up a meeting with Sator is thwarted, as she reveals that her husband already knows that the $9 million he spent on it were a waste. Sator is using this knowledge to control her completely. During their last vacation, in spite of her attempts to try to again have intimate feelings for him, he offered her the choice of divorce only if she agreed to never see her son again. Contact with her son is another aspect he controls. She can't leave him, and she never even knew the artwork was fake. That fact was never entertained by Sator, who only responds to disloyalty. Catherine reveals that Sator killed Arepo when the protagonist offers himself at an opportunity to get out from under her husband. They are interrupted by some of Sator's muscle, who ultimately fail at brutalizing the man for speaking to his wife. At another meeting, Barton tells the man that she thinks the other Goya is at an airport in Oslo, in a storage facility built and arranged by her and Andre that enables clients to view their valuable investments while avoiding taxation. Neil gets a tour of the location, posing as a potential customer. Washington tells him to ask about fire procedures designed to protect the items. As a measure to create a diversion in order to get to the art piece, they employed the aid of Mahir, who is a fixer. While strategizing maneuvers against the fire countermeasures, which quickly remove all oxygen through the use of halide gas and shuts all available doors, the protagonist examines the blueprints of the location, concluding that they display an area too large for a simple storage facility. While the man and Neil enter the storage site, Mahir and his aide commandeer a plane and get rid of the pilots and crew, also dumping the gold cargo as an additional part of the distraction. The planned crash is successful as it sets off the fire systems. The host runs out of the area to avoid suffocation while the two men circumvent the locks to get to the storage area, holding their breaths. They accidentally come across the inversion turnstile on both sides of the device which eventually is activated. Suddenly, stormtroopers appear on both sides. The protagonist and Neil physically battle with their own soldiers, with the former almost getting hit with bullets returning from the glass to their weapon, a gun he himself found on the floor moments before the door activated. During his scuffle, Neil unmasks his man and inexplicably lets him go, later telling Washington that he killed him. The other duplicate is beaten and aggressively questioned by the protagonist, with threats to shoot him in the arm, but ends up being sucked out by one of the crashed airplane's engines, taking the weapon along with him. The two men then fake passing out from the lack of oxygen, to then be rescued by paramedics summoned by the facility's staff. The next day, Neil is informed on all the details of the bizarre time-warping events that are taking place, along with their world-ending implications. The finding of the inversion doorway was accidental, as all they were after was the Goya art piece. In another meeting with Priya, she discloses that both stormtroopers were the same individual and that Sator built that device. Furthermore, it was created in the future, since this technology does not yet exist. Priya also describes that the device found at the Opera House was plutonium-241, which is what Sator was trying to obtain from the protagonist and his team in that incident. Andrei's team was intervened by Ukrainian forces instead, procuring the 241. Priya insists, against the man's wishes, to not simply assassinate Andrei as a solution to everything, at least not until all of his objectives in this entire future-altering operations are discovered. In a subsequent conversation with Barton, the man lies and claims to have obtained and destroyed the Goya. He asks her to arrange a meeting with Sator, with descriptions that he is a secretary from the American Embassy in Riyadh that she met months ago, with additional information that would make Andrei think they're having an affair, a conclusion certainly leading to a desire to meet. This sentiment is initially implied when the protagonist drives her to her husband's yacht, deliberately arousing suspicions. In addition to asking her questions about who Washington is, he also informs her that he sent her son away to Pompeii without letting her know. At the meeting, Sator responds to arrogant statements by the man's intentions towards his wife with creative methods on how to have his life ended, until he mentions the topic of the opera, referring to the concert hall and thus the plutonium. Considering the public setting and the topic of discussion, the meeting is rescheduled for the next day. With the misled thought that the fake Goya was destroyed, Catherine is much more confident against her husband the next day, only to have him presented to her safe and sound as a reminder that he is still able to blackmail her. The art is a brutal response to one of her insults, including the fact that she no longer loves him. He claims that he had instincts that told him to remove it from the airport as part of his consistent intuitions about the future. The meeting takes place aboard a sailboat, an F-50, with an angry Catherine accompanying them. Upon asking about the opera, the protagonist mentions the origins of the plutonium now seized by the Ukrainians, a remote missile station back in 2008. Sator is uneasy about the proposed idea of a partnership, accusing the man of being an agent, when Barton releases his safety line, throwing him overboard. The protagonist saves him, a decision that confuses her. Catherine later angrily tells the man that the Goya is still intact, but is told why Sator cannot yet be killed, as he can affect all of humanity's future. He gives her a gun, now that Sator will certainly punish her for her attempt at his life. Sator demands a meeting to thank him for saving his life, but the protagonist instead wants to discuss procuring the plutonium. It is being transported to a nuclear storage facility in Tallinn, the same city as the Opera House. Andrei ends the conversation instead by inviting him for dinner after describing his teen years in Stalks 12. He took an extremely hazardous job to find plutonium that was dispersed when a warhead exploded there. Though he simply explains that this occupation was a major turning point in his life, the film shows him accidentally coming across gold bars with some documents and then killing his co-worker to claim the findings, making him rich and also the only person at present to have a company operating in that devastated city. Andre then meets Catherine to deliver a beating for her actions. After some fairly egregious insults delivered by both parties, Sato declares that if he can't have her, then no one else can. She responds by saying that noises from an assault on her would prompt interference from the protagonist, which would result in a cancellation of their deal, since Andre would obviously kill him when he presumably would try to intervene. In addition to this fact, a helicopter delivery of inverted gold bars also stops this intense conversation. Washington snoops around, sees Andre with the gold and killing someone who had been caught stealing one of the bars, and is caught himself. Sator questions him about who he actually is and how he knows about the events at the Opera House. He justifies his snooping and his extensive knowledge of events surrounding nuclear materials. Sator utters the same code sentence stated by the man at the opera, but receives sarcasm by the protagonist instead, in spite of his perilous situation. Andre declares that Volkov will assist him in Tallinn when getting the plutonium, and hands him an altered gold bar covered in the blood of his victim as a form of down payment. The man demands Catherine make the exchange of money for the plutonium to Sator once he steals it. Neil is told how Andre tells his people in the future when and where to deliver his gold and the other inverted materials. The plutonium is transported in a convoy in the busy central part of the city, since it's believed to be a difficult location for a heist. Sator takes his wife to a compound containing arms to be sold. The weapons are to make it clear to her that her lavish existence is due to what she wants to avoid deliberating, that is, arms dealing. The trip is also to finalize the deal with Washington. She refuses to go with Andre to meet with the protagonist, who is presumably soon to procure the 241 when he explodes in anger in response. He swiftly seizes the gun she pulls on him given to her by the man and then attacks her, spitting in the process. He then enters the inversion turnstile, ordering his people to monitor the protagonist's progress. Neil and the man and their team engage in the theft of the plutonium, jamming communication signals and using a fire truck and other vehicles. They procure the material. However, the protagonist describes that the item definitely does not look like any containment he's ever seen for this type of substance. Neil declares that what he does have is specifically what Sator wants. An inverted car catches up to them. Unable to lose it, Sator shows himself in that vehicle, threatening his wife and counting down from 3 to 1. Another inverted vehicle reverses from an upside-down crash and joins the race. Convinced that the device is not plutonium and worried for Barton, the man throws it to Andre despite Neil's assurance that doing so is a mistake. The object is worse than plutonium. The third car does not engage, but Sator and his driver climb into another vehicle, leaving Catherine in an aimless high-speed car tied up. In spite of her limitations, she helps the man get in and stop the car right before a collision. While Neil is being fired upon, a car deliberately crashes into Barton and the protagonist, and the two are taken. She apparently was inverted, as the protagonist notices her and Sator's reversed movements when taken to the compound housing the guns. Though speaking backwards, Andre's voice is corrected through speakers as he questions the man, threatening Barton if he lies. He asks where the device is, while the man claims that he doesn't know. He shoots Catherine. This is seen as a bullet already located in a glass separating the two parties, going through her and returning to its weapon. The man tells a normal Andre that appears out of the turnstile while his inverted copy watches through the glass that the device is in the BMW he and Neil were driving. Before Sator is able to kill him, a team of soldiers appear firing weapons, prompting Andre to go back in the doorway. He witnesses the last several moments backwards as he then tortures Catherine, hears the location of the device, and the couple leaves the building. In the protagonist's reality, Catherine is being helped and he attacks Neil when he describes Ives and his troops as people on their side. Surprised that there is even a group of soldiers to begin with involved in all this, The man is convinced that Neil at some point told Sator about the ambush, since Andre knew everything about the operation. Ives assures him that no one was a traitor and that he and his men were running what he called a temporal pincer movement. He explains how Sator has been on top of the situation, and then the man tells Neil that he just lied to Andre, convinced that no matter what, Andre was going to shoot Barton. She, being the victim of an inverted projectile, is in great danger of death, as Laura described at the beginning of the story the unusual perils of such an injury. To address the wound, Washington wants to invert her. The problem is, however, that they just took control of this turnstile right now, and they need to go back up to a week in time to make sure that Catherine pulls through. He remembers the other doorway at the airport and tells Neil that he's got to get her there. He also plans on going through the doorway himself to try to get the device before Sator, who just went through that turnstile for the same goal. Barton begins to stabilize as soon as they all take her through. Neil tells Washington that no matter what he tries, the temporal mechanisms will not allow him to change any events as they have occurred. He goes anyway and is told not to come into contact with himself, as annihilation will be the result. Furthermore, his inverted body cannot adjust to air in this environment. Fire will feel like ice, and most other occurrences will have similar reversed effects, including hearing, vision, and gravity. While witnessing everything moving backwards, the protagonist tracks his GPS to get his previous locations. Sator is at the shootout finding nothing in the BMW, while the man struggles to drive correctly. He eventually puts a tracker in the abandoned empty case and sees it bouncing back into Sator's car. Again, with difficulty, he follows Andre and soon hears orders from him to get other components of a device he calls the algorithm to a hypocenter after declaring that Washington was lying. The man makes eye contact with a surprised Andre when he catches the case. The component held by the original protagonist bounces around his vehicle and originates back to him. Then the two Washingtons make eye contact. Sator slams his car into his, which loses control and ends up upside down. With the man barely able to apply his oxygen, Andre declares that he saw the handing off of the device, also stating that he thus made him shoot Barton for nothing. He lights the leaking gas with a lighter, and the resulting flames turn into a freezing effect due to Washington's inverted state. He wakes up near Neil, who describes that he's been rescued by Ives and his team. They're headed back to the airport in Oslo in a shipping container, as the protagonist laments the fact that Sator now has the device. He stops Neil's complaints about that outcome by saying that he now realizes that he was part of this entire situation even before they met. Neil refuses to disclose who recruited him initially, and a barely functioning Catherine demands to know everything. He delivers all the information despite Neil's reservations that by doing so, it makes her a liability in Priya's eyes, but Washington states that this is already the case. The container is now on board a ship as Washington listens to Sator's orders about the epicenter and the algorithm. He asks what that device is after noticing an injury on his arm. Neil explains that the 241 is one of 9 sections of the algorithm. A complicated explanation leads to the final goal of that device, the total destruction of everything, instantly. Later, when the two men discuss the implications of Andre's people in the future and their plans, Neil states that they're convinced that whatever they're doing to affect their past, it will not affect them in their time, in spite of the logical conclusion that it might. Thus, they are willing to destroy the present. The protagonist asks if the mere fact that the two of them are aware of all these facts and are taking actions, would that be enough to deter plans from the future? To which Neil has no definite answer. The people driving them to the airport stop short of the facility. Washington's arm is getting worse as he notices a hole in his sleeve and blood. With masks on and with Barton, they use the chaos of the airliner crash they orchestrated themselves earlier as a means to sneak inside. The engine that previously exploded at the initial plane hijacking blows Washington inside, where he runs into his former self who is moving backwards like everything else. The two brawl, not only leading to the injury to his arm, but to the firing of the bullets into the separating glass. Then, the protagonist runs into the turnstile to come across Neil on the other side. It's there, moments later, that he is unmasked during their brawl and is let go. He tells Neil to get in with Catherine. When he does enter, the halide gas inverts itself back into their containers. He sees the duo from the initial infiltration while the man commandeers a vehicle. Neil uninverts himself and Catherine back to normal through the turnstile, and they all drive away, passing their inverted selves from moments earlier. Washington points out that clearly Neil saw him at their previous time at the airport, and he responds that if he was told about that previous encounter with him, it might have altered his set of decisions with unknowable results. The withholding of this type of information is, ironically, a policy the two of them created. Barton is scarred but will recover. She describes, however, that Sator has the device and no one knows where he is. The man meets with Priya in Tallinn, blaming her for Catherine's near-death condition. He reveals that he knows what the algorithm actually is instead of plutonium. Seeing that he is more informed than in their last meeting, she describes that the woman who constructed the device took her own life afterwards in order to prevent constructing another one. She equates that venture to Oppenheimer, who was concerned that his invention might severely affect the world. The results here were dire, but not as terrifying as he feared. With the algorithm, its creator was indeed afraid that by destroying her past, she was destroying the world in their time. Unlike Oppenheimer, she did not go forward with her work and split her device into 9 sections and hid them into the past. They are stored in nuclear facilities, considering the elevated level of security at each international location maintained by the 9 nuclear superpowers in the world. Sator wants to reassemble the complete algorithm and was chosen from the people in the future at a perfect time and place, the downfall of the Soviet Union. He now has all the pieces. Washington suggests never allowing that to happen in the first place and informing him that the plutonium was actually a doomsday component back at the very beginning of this situation. She refuses, saying that if that reality could exist, they are not living in it. She eventually reveals that she used him to get the 241 to Sator the same way that he used Barton in order to get all the components in one place. She stops his implications that he is the protagonist of this entire operation by letting him know that he is just one of many involved, and she is now done with him. She and others she works with will now do what they can to save the world. As he knows where and when Sator will assemble the entire device to detonate it, and she doesn't, he bargains that fact to force her to letting him and Catherine back into the operation. He forces her to promise that once everything is done, she will not lay a finger on Barton and her son. Though she mentions that in her line of business, someone's word isn't very valuable, she agrees and states that she'll arrange for the 3 of them to meet with Ives and his teams in Trondheim City in Norway, essentially revealing that she surprisingly has a turnstile of her own and that Tenet was actually founded in the future. On their way to the Ives operation, Barton is told why killing Sator is not an option. Upon death, his health monitoring watch would activate the algorithm, destroying everything. She, however, informs the men that he is already dying of cancer, thus essentially already planning on taking the world with him. Washington tells Catherine that she must meet her husband on the yacht and stall him in order for him to prevent the algorithm from being placed into the designated drop zone for detonation. She is to meet Andre the day he disappeared, when she saw a woman dive off the boat. The protagonist tells Ives that the drop zone is the spot where an explosion occurred the very day of Sator's disappearance in Stalks 12. Andre and his men are planning on using that eruption to seal the algorithm there, where it can explode without anyone preventing the world-ending blast. Ives, his men, and Washington inversely travel back to that date. As last words before he does, Catherine laments the fact that her husband saw in her face that she, even for a moment, considered the option of divorce even though it meant abandoning her son. The man reminds her, when she describes the awful matter of killing her husband, that is the act of the murder itself, that she is there only to stall him, part of the overall effort of saving all life on earth. He also gives her a phone to use if, after this entire operation, she ever feels like she is in danger. Washington and the team arrive at the location. He is with the red team, while the other half, the blue team including Neil, is inverted, and their experiences in the upcoming future hours has provided Ives with crucial information. Some of this intelligence is the fact that there's an additional pathway to the bomb. Barton and Mahir witness her other self leaving the ship with her son. Team Red have watches counting down from 10 minutes to the explosion, while the other team's timer is the other way around. Members of that team must get to the landing zone at the end time, or they are not leaving. The red team will clear that area for the blue team to evacuate and then make their way into the city. Though abandoned, the town has a turnstile, so Ives expects forces from Sator that are also inverted and others that are conventional. He explains that the bomb is in the rock area above the hole to be used for the sealing of the device. The plan is actually to fail to prevent the explosion that seals the device in that cavity. A splinter team will go to that area undetected after the blast using the additional pathway. He does not disclose what this unit's mission is when asked. That operation is to deactivate the algorithm, and that unit is made up of only Ives and Washington. Furthermore, no one who knows what the device is can leave that zone alive, as it is information too dangerous to have. Catherine swims to the yacht with a weapon after Mahir describes he will signal her when she is free to kill Sator. The teams advance and immediately meet resistance. Barton arrives and arranges her plan, including hiding her weapon close by, as Andre lands on board. The red team arrives, including the man, who sees the blue team moving in reverse, that is, going towards the center of the town backwards. As part of that team, Neil's perspective also sees the red team moving in reverse. Andre, confused as he thought his wife had left, quickly forgets this fact, and both express desires for reconciliation. Red team moves forward dealing with attacks, events, and explosions moving in both time directions, often resulting in casualties. The protagonist spots the entrance to the tunnel, but as Ives doesn't want Sator's forces to see them enter it to get access to the algorithm, both the red and blue team destroy a building as a diversion. As both men rush in, a Hummer behind them sounds its horn. Once past the doorway, a foot trap sets off explosives, sealing them in permanently. On the boat, Andre looks at a cyanide pill, which Catherine suggests he not ingest, as for one, it would certainly kill the romantic moment. Back at the battle scene, Neil witnesses Volkov in reverse, setting the door traps. He then heads for Sator's local turnstile. Ives and Washington arrive at the drop area, find it locked, and see a soldier laying on the platform. When searching the body, the man sees a coin attached to a string, the same items belonging to the individual that saved him at the opera. Suddenly, Volkov shoots and injures Ives, and Andre's voice comes through his cell phone, clearly aware of their plans to foil the world-ending explosion. The protagonist chastises him for making a deal with the devil, that is the villains in the future, sealing the fate of humanity. Andre responds by saying that the man barely understands the cause he is fighting for and barely trusts the people he's working with. He will soon die with all of his knowledge. He states that he is not destroying the world, but creating a new one. The people in the future want to destroy us because, as a result of the actions of humanity at present, the future is devastated, a complete disaster. The only choice is to turn back. With everything he knows, he tells Sator that he still wants to stop the algorithm. He scolds Andre for destroying the world his son lives in, and Sator blames himself for bringing life into a world he knew would end, wondering if God would forgive him. Throughout this conversation, Volkov orders Washington hand over his weapon and prepares the bomb for the drop. Neil, now altered by the turnstile, is the individual in the Hummer, failing to prevent Ives and Washington from going into the tunnel. The protagonist states that Andre doesn't believe in God, the future, or anything outside of his own existence. In the end, he is a madman, or a god of sorts, as Sator puts it as an answer. Volkov begins the process of dropping the algorithm, while Sator says he'll send regards to his wife from the protagonist, who reminds him that at this time this far in the past, he has not yet met her. The bomb does not drop as Volkov's release mechanism malfunctions. He stops his efforts to fix this problem when ordered to kill Washington by Andre, but is interrupted by the soldier from the floor, who suddenly gets up and takes the bullet after quickly unlocking the gate. The man shoots Volkov twice, not fatally, drops the gun, and the two struggle while trying to handle the device. Blue team approaches their exit location while Neil drives closer to the tunnel. Ives comes to, grabs the gun from the platform, and watches as an alive and inverted Neil runs away from the platform. Meanwhile, Barton continues to stall her husband. The protagonist manages to throw Volkov in the drop hole while Catherine, at the end of her ability to pretend, reveals that she is the Barton Andre thought he had killed. She shoots him dead after declaring that he will die alone and throws him overboard. This is to the shock of Mahir, who had repeatedly received word from Ives that Catherine could not kill Sator yet. He reports what he just witnessed to the two men, who were now certain they had failed in their plan to remove the bomb from the drop spot. A cable drops from above. The men attach themselves and the bomb to the cord and are pulled by its owner, Neil, moments before the ceiling explosion occurs. The blue team leaves, wondering if everyone's efforts were successful. Catherine jumps overboard to go back to Mahir and is witnessed by her other self coming back to the yacht. She contacts Washington, apologizing for killing Andre before it was time to do so, citing that she could not let him die, thinking he had won. She is relieved to know that the operation was successful. Neil meets the men. Ives asks how the protagonist opened the gate in front of the drop spot, to which he says he was not the one to release the door. Ives grabs the device once Washington tries to take it, with gun in hand. The man repeats what Ives said right before the operation, but instead he disassembles the algorithm into three components. He orders them to hide these pieces and then to commit suicide, and that if he instead were ever to find them, he will do that job himself. When asked by Neil, the man claims he will not check on Barton, as even doing that is dangerous for her. Neil joins Ives after giving his component to Washington. He plans on going back in, as he is a great locksmith, the only one good enough to open the gate at the drop spot. The protagonist notices the coin and string hanging from the back of Neil's backpack, meaning that he sacrificed himself when opening the door for Washington and that he also saved him at the opera house. Neil's decision to go back in is to be certain that nothing is left to chance. In spite of just having saved the world, doing nothing is not an option. And this is even knowing that going back in time and attempting to change things will ultimately result in the same outcomes. Lastly, Neil is surprised that the man asks him who recruited him in the first place, which was the protagonist himself. Neil has known him for years, but for Washington, it was just the beginning of their relationship. Later in London, Catherine uses the phone given to her by the man, as she felt like she was being watched. He stops Priya's assassin from murdering her and then kills Priya after she reminds him that promises made by people in their business, especially her promise to not harm Barton, are not very valuable. The protagonist declared that he was the one to tie up loose ends, not Priya. Washington also stated that both of them were actually working for him, implying that all of this was planned by him in the future. He then watches Catherine and her son walk away. I am currently editing a review and it should be released soon. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you come back for our analysis. Thanks for watching.